Assignment education on KET is made possible with generous support from
the Neighbor Carter Group at Baird. Wealth management with quality, perspective, honesty, and integrity. The Neighbor Carter Group.rwbaird.com.
I'm Sam Corbett on Assignment Education, where we cover issues facing our Kentucky schools and also discover solutions. This time, feeding the mind and the body, the effort to make sure no child goes hungry. Plus, we explore the connection between education, COVID-19, and equity.
Put all of that together and talk about what this experience has been like for the most vulnerable populations.
And Kentucky leads the nation when it comes to children living with family members who are not their parents. Are those caregivers getting enough support?
There is a need for more resources for these kids.
And good news on the playground, how one school is stepping up big to make sure everyone is included.
She had no playground to play on because she's in a wheelchair.
And up first, a surprising partnership between Kentucky schools and the Federal Reserve.
This comes as a surprise to a lot of folks.
They're doing a lot more than banking at the Federal Reserve these days. They're also big into education.
Education in the economic sphere is really important to the Federal Reserve.
Nikki Lanier runs the Federal Reserve's Louisville office.
But if you think about our goal, and that is to stabilize the nation's economy, there's a number of ways by which that can be accomplished. One of them is making sure that we have citizens in this country who have some level of education or rooting around the basics of how the economy works.
We work with preschool all the way through college.
Mary Suter is the Economic Education Officer at the St. Louis branch of the Fed.
When people better understand the economy and are able to make better financial decisions for themselves, that it aggregates up to help the economy as a whole.
Our approach is to teach those who teach economics, so we don't do a lot of student-facing work. Our primary impact, we think, is by teaching those who are already in a position to be in front of the classroom and talking to students, to give them the tools to weave in to their already existing programs.
And we do really try to focus very much on reaching teachers and helping them understand the content, but also with providing them with classroom resources that they can use.
We've just got such rich offerings in this regard.
It's just a plethora of information, and it's something that as a teacher I don't have to reinvent the wheel with.
Dr. Catherine Timmerman has used the Fed's resources, teaching elementary school kids at Shelby Traditional Academy.
Anything you need to teach, you are going to find a resource there, whether you're teaching something in kindergarten, whether you're teaching something on the collegiate level. It's much easier to learn something when you're 5 and integrate it into the way that you do things than when you're 55 or 60 and retirement is knocking on your door.
Is there a real void there with our students today?
It's not something that I think that's been traditionally focused on, which is why it's important that organizations like ours, the Federal Reserve, find ways to supplement and augment what's happening in the classroom.
Financial literacy is incredibly important. It's a life skill.
Last year, Kentucky's teachers set up more than 60 virtual classrooms with help from the Fed through a website called econlowdown.org.
So we want to help people understand the economy and help them be informed about the personal finances.
You know, we've got PhD level economists who are both steeped as economists and educators, which is a really interesting pairing, who are developing this award-winning curriculum for these students.
And now on the subject of online learning. While it might be working for some, others feel like it might be working against them. I'm here today with Dr. Kish Kumi-Price, who's with the Louisville Urban League as their Director of Education Policy and Programming. Dr. Price, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In your position at the Urban League, you kind of get a good overview of the community, parents, educators, whatever. Tell us what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of frustrations from everyone. The students, the educators, parents, community partners. Everyone who's been touched by this is really just frustrated with everything, including the administrators. that are trying to, provide whatever is possible under their purview for this to be as successful as it could be.
Many of our students, many of our children have experienced huge learning losses during this time. In some cases, maybe they were behind before the pandemic started and they only slipped further behind.
Absolutely.
What kind of strategies do we need to be thinking about in order to help these kids to catch up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it will take a collaborative effort in thinking about what some of those strategies could be, what's feasible. I think this is a great time to really ask educators what their stressors are and ask for solutions in those areas. I think it's also a great time to be checking in with students and parents and the community partners that have been assisting during this time with community learning hubs. And so for us, some of the recommendations that we have is really prioritizing mental health, understanding that a lot of our students have experienced a great deal of trauma, and that extends to the educators and administrators as well. So really prioritizing that, understanding we don't really know what will be walking through the doors in terms of the impact that will have on students and also those educators. And so the more that we can bolster supports for that piece, really looking at the experiences that students and educators may have had outside of the classroom and creating a more compassionate environment for learning, I think is huge. We've also talked about the idea of making learning fun, because students are really in a place where I think they're just tired of what they've had to endure with this NTI experience. So how can you make learning engaging and fun, and really have an opportunity for students to even engage in more physical activity? A lot of students haven't had the opportunity to be engaged that way because they've been at home and sedentary for the most part. And we know how much physical activity helps with the social emotional components as well. So we really want to advocate for that. And then also looking at just what supports are there for what I guess you would say, the outcomes of that trauma that may be there. So if a student acts out, what's the plan for that to protect the student and the teacher or educators? And so those are the things that we'd love for the district to have really firm plans on, and really pull in community partners to help to strategize in those areas. You're not ready to learn if you don't feel like you're in a safe environment. And so we really have to ensure that is highlighted. There are times when it may be a district-wide initiative, but when it is rolled out, is not necessarily the same at every school, which it shouldn't be expected to be the same. There should be an opportunity to customize based on the school and the population. But I would hope that the recommendations that they put forth and the guidance that they put forth is prioritized, and there is a plan that adheres to that in various ways, whatever fits the school and the population. So
in the work you're doing for the Louisville Urban League, you mentioned that you're trying to expand your all's reach and looking more statewide versus just Louisville, Jefferson County. Now other school systems within Kentucky, many of them have been having in-person learning for quite a while. But can you comment on what you're seeing from a state perspective versus just Louisville, Jefferson County?
Absolutely. I think there are some similarities that we see with even rural areas compared to what our population is here in Jefferson County. Is just really looking at the most vulnerable students and how we can collectively advocate for the most vulnerable populations. And one of those issues is just the digital divide. So looking at the resources that were put forth in Jefferson County, we were fortunate to be able to have Chromebooks provided to all students and hotspots if needed. However, there were components that I don't think many of us prepared for, and that would be the learning curve that a lot of families had to experience if they were not familiar with technology. And most families were not familiar with having to rely on technology in this way, period. That's across the board, but even more so with families that are low-income families, Black and brown families, and our ELL population specifically. It's just a really tough lift when we talk about those populations, because we also know that a good portion of the essential workers are Black and brown people, right? We also know that this virus attacked the Black and brown population at disproportionate rates. And so when you put all of that together and talk about what this experience has been like for the most vulnerable populations, it has not been ideal. There hasn't been a lot of support. And even when there has been an extra layer of support, it hasn't been as wide and as vast as we need it to be. And that's where at the state level, I think those changes can be made, where we see the connections between rural and urban populations and the need to be more collective in our voice.
Right.
Because there aren't any traditional assessments, K-PREP scores aren't available from the previous year. There's been no MAP testing to really gauge any kind of growth in learning. Grades have been used to really look at, well, what's going on in terms of academic engagement. And so what both reports have shown for both Jefferson County Public Schools and Lexington-Fayette County is that there's been an upsurge in failing grades. And the greatest disproportionalities are within middle school. And we know that that is a critical time for students when they are moving from elementary to middle. They have more teachers, they have more classes, and it's also a very pivotal time in terms of their identity formation. So they're not really even being able to engage with peers. And to be honest, I mean, there's a way to mitigate that issue, a very clear way, which is to really focus on, well, what do we expect students to be learning right now, or how do we expect them to learn, and how do we expect them to show what they're learning? And so from an equity lens, this is also something that's very similar across these two districts, is that Black and brown students are still not performing as well as white students, and that is not a testament to the students, but it's a testament to the system. Part of that being that we are still in this space that's not really acknowledging the weight of the times that we're in. There is this dual pandemic space that we're in, with a lot of racial traumas that students are experiencing, and the virus itself is attacking Black and brown communities at rates beyond what anybody anticipated. And so when you have all of these measures just piled on top of each other, and then you say, well, we're going to grade this student as if none of this is happening. So essentially you end up grading the family and that family's ability to support the child in this very strange time, or not. And so there have been a lot of efforts, I think, within the community to try to support community learning hubs, being one of the greatest ways, I think, to do that, where families can drop off their child and the child can get some support during the day. But even still, it's a very difficult load for those community partners who have all kinds of schools represented in that one location, and really trying to tap into what each child needs is really difficult. And so I think we have to caution the district in how they are really looking at what a student has accomplished during this period of time or not, and also own that the district was not ready to be able to provide what each student needed in this time to be successful. So what does that grade really reflect?
Is there one thing, one piece of advice you would give to parents or grandparents as far as working with their children, dealing with all the stresses around education today? What's the one thing you'd say to parents?
I would say the one thing would be to just focus on love, affirming them, being that sounding board of reason. And it's difficult, right? When parents are stretched and stressed, it's very difficult to be in that place all the time with your children. But whether they say it or not, they're stressed. The kids are stressed as well, and they may not be receiving some of those normal ways to feel loved. Or we know that our educators are usually the ones that students can rely on to provide some of that compassion and some of that affirmation, and also their peers. But given this situation, they have not been able to really rely on either one of those populations. Even when they have synchronous learning, they're not necessarily engaging directly with their peers, and they feel like they're being watched. So it's not as genuine and authentic as it used to be. So I would say really focus on listening to your child, loving them, being compassionate, really trying to hear what they're saying, and figuring out how to best support them. One of the ways that I think that can be done is really advocating for their children right now, because there are teachers that are stressed, but they also want to really support kids right now in understanding where they are. You know, if they've been disengaged, please contact that teacher and explain, this has not been an ideal environment for my child, and we want to make sure that they're moving forward as best as they can. Please explain to me how I can best support my child. Identify the top assignments that need to be turned in, some of the core pieces, so that they don't feel overwhelmed with the fact that they've been disengaged and have a multitude of assignments that are now due. Right. But you know, really being able to open those lines of communication, I think that's where I would go.
Dr. Price, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your insight, and good luck with your work at the Louisville Urban League.
Thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate it.
No matter if school is online or in person, you can't feed minds without first nourishing bodies. Still, many are fighting food insecurity on a daily basis. But we can fight hunger, and one of the best ways to do it is with generosity. Sometimes the most important thing in a student's backpack isn't schoolwork.
The school is a part of the whole system.
For thousands of local kids, taking home food for the weekend from Blessings in a Backpack is vital.
Lunchtime.
For many of them, that's the food that they're going to have all weekend.
Stewart Academy Assistant Principal Brandon Cobb says the effect of hunger is significant at school, causing shorter attention spans and gaps in academic achievement.
One of the main things that we try to do is ensure that we get all kids their basic needs that they have to be successful before we even begin with academics.
Kids who come to school hungry can't be expected to learn at the rate of other kids who have been fed.
So we start with the basic essential physiological needs that they need first, and we address those, and then we move into the academic support that they need for success.
We have Fruit Loops here, and we have Apple Jacks.
Tacola Bowling makes sure the backpacks are delivered discreetly.
I think that's important, because if you don't do that, then most students will shy away from the resource.
There is no stigma associated with it. Kids are not embarrassed to receive it.
I have a locker key that's universal for all the lockers, and I deliver them in their lockers, so when they come in on Friday mornings, they can privately put it in their backpacks and put it on their backs and go home. If we didn't have Blessings in a Backpack, we would refer them to a local food pantry or a Dare to Care, but if they don't have transportation, they can't get there. So this helps to eliminate barriers that families and students will face.
Here at Stewart, the program runs entirely on a donation from LG&E, so the school can focus on raising kids instead of raising money.
Previously, it was done grassroots kind of operations. Right. We were grateful to have that from LG&E, to where it was a one-time thing, and it saved us a lot of time and a lot of energy.
Blessings is a great partnership, because we have employees that are in this area that we know live and work in this area and are involved in this area, and so it makes sense that we would support a great school like Stewart.
Now to the issue of kinship care, which is when a family member other than a child's parent becomes their primary caregiver. It's more common in Kentucky than anywhere else in America. I'm here now with Norma Hatfield, who's with the Kinship Families Coalition of Kentucky. Norma, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So help our viewers understand, what is kinship care? What is that all about?
Kinship care is when a child is placed with a relative other than the biological parent, and they are taking care of those kids. Unfortunately, in many circumstances, it's because these children have been abused and neglected and they've been removed from their home.
And I've learned that Kentucky, and this is truly unfortunate, is one of the leaders in the nation as far as the number of children who are living in a kinship care situation.
Yes, in fact, there are 100,000 kids that are in that situation.
So you're involved in this effort statewide and maybe even regionally or nationally for a very personal reason. That is, you're raising 2 grandchildren. Talk to us about that situation.
Yeah, in 2014, my grandkids were in a home where the youngest child, who was 17 months old, ingested meth. And they were removed and they were put in foster care. And the system didn't work the way it was supposed to. We didn't get a phone call. But once we found out about it, we began going to court, and eventually we got permanent custody of both kids.
As a grandparent, I'm very sensitive to this. There would be lots of challenges in raising grandchildren, particularly in today's world. You not only have the emotional, the psychological, but there's a couple other areas that are significant. One would be the financial implication. The other would be how these grandparents and other family members are dealing with educational systems as we are involved in distance learning and other things. Start out by talking about some of the financial challenges and what's available from a state support standpoint or is not available.
Well, definitely the financial has a very big impact on many of the caregivers. I mean, stop and think about this situation. You've got a single widowed grandmother who is in a small apartment, and she's got a small car, and she's living on her nest egg. That's all she has, Social Security. And she gets that phone call, and all of a sudden she's got 3-5 kids that she has to bring in and she has to raise, and there's not a lot of assistance there. I've talked to many of them that have gone bankrupt and in debt, and they've lost their homes, they've lost their cars, and they're struggling, but they're trying to keep these kids out of foster care. There is a need for more resources for these kids when they are removed from their home in a system and placed elsewhere. I personally think that these children are penalized because they're placed with family instead of being in the system in foster care. The kids have gone through the same situation, but they're treated differently.
And what are you seeing and hearing from people, and what are you dealing with personally with your youngest, who's 13, I believe you said, around school and education, particularly with what we're dealing with during the pandemic and the distance learning and in school, out of school? How's that working for people?
It's complicated. You've got some single grandparents, and the age ranges. Some of them are in their 50s, they're still working. You've got some that are older and they're retired. They need them to go to school, but at the same time, they feel they're more high risk because of their age group. They're concerned that if something happens to them, where would these kids go? And so that kind of compiles some of the fear as far as whether they should be in school or not in school. They struggle because you've got to stop and think that a lot of these families are low income anyway. So all of a sudden you've got to worry about 2 or 3 kids that are streaming on the internet when you don't have the resources for that. You've got to worry about helping them with being the IT support for their computers when most of them don't really use computers and they're not IT savvy. It's very complicated. I had one grandmother reach out to me and she was in tears. She said, especially during the pandemic, she said, I don't have, where we live is an apartment, I don't have a yard, I don't have anything. So I have all these kids in my house, and it's been this way for months and months and months, and I just need somebody to talk to. And it's stressful on the kids as well.
So what advice would you have for a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or whomever that finds themselves in this situation? Are there one or two things that pop into your mind that you could share with people?
I would say if you have a child that's of school age, talk to your Family Resource Center coordinator. They can connect you with resources. They can help you find things that you might need locally in your community. The second thing I would do is reach out to the Kinship Families Coalition of Kentucky or go to their website. We have a listing of support groups that are in the particular, in particular areas across the state, because talking to somebody that's been going through what you're going through is huge. Knowing you're not alone.
What's the website?
kinshipky.org.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing this information with us. Again, as a grandparent, I just hats off to you and thousands of our fellow Kentuckians who are stepping up and providing that care for their grandchildren. That's really impressive, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Now we turn our attention to the playground, where playtime can be just as important to the development of a child as classroom time, which is why some local schools are making big investments, making sure everyone can join the fun. In some cases, we have kind of lost the play aspect of education and we're focused too much on the other stuff. At Holy Trinity Parish School in Louisville, they're deeply committed to recess.
And trying to make sure that each side of that child is developed.
And Principal Jack Richards says that goes for every child.
We had several students that couldn't play with their classmates.
It's no fun if some of the kids can't play.
Steve Diebold and his wife are parishioners at Holy Trinity, who made a substantial gift, helping to create a new playground that's open to everyone.
We didn't want to see any child be excluded.
We needed this poured in place foundation, which is that like foamy material.
The gift was a godsend for Kylie and Nicholas Holscher, whose daughter Eden suffered a spinal cord injury when she was 5 years old.
She had no playground to play on because she's in a wheelchair. A wheelchair can't wheel across mulch. So she spent a lot of her time sitting under trees, sitting at picnic tables, blowing bubbles and things like that, but basically sitting on the outside of playgrounds and watching all the other students at school play while she watched.
Right. The new playground, with its poured-in-place surface and accessible equipment, has changed everything, and not just for Eden.
She was surrounded by kids. They see her as, yeah, she's in a wheelchair, but she can still do what we can do, and they weren't able to see that before.
It's nice to end with a story as uplifting as that. I'm Sam Corbett, and we'll see you again with more good news from our local schools on Assignment Education. Assignment Education on KET is made possible with generous support from
the Vay-Neighbor Carter Group at Baird. Wealth management with quality, perspective, honesty, and integrity. The Vay-Neighbor Carter Group.rwbaird.com.